Hi, Smarter News. Here's what I'm curious about as we end this week of news. A question that comes up in several of the key stories that we've covered. What crosses the line? Who crosses the line, and how do we determine that? And we're seeing that question surface in many stories that we're covering, from the celebrity to court cases. So I thought this is a good moment just to talk a little bit about that. And really, what we're talking about crossing the line, we're talking about the rights of an individual with another entity, oftentimes the state or with the government. And hasn't that been a key question really over the last year? What crosses the line of what the government is asking from you as a citizen during a pandemic, for example? So I'm really curious about this idea of personal liberty and how it looks in America and different stories. And that's what we're really seeing in several of these stories, albeit at many different levels, many different dynamics. So let me start first with the top celebrity story this week. We really didn't cover it too much on Smarter News, and there's a reason for that, which I'll explain as I share some of my reporting. So one of the biggest stories on the planet is what happened with Britney Spears this week. For the very first time in more than a decade, she spoke out about what's really happening behind closed doors, in her opinion, about her state of affairs. And we know that she's under something called conservatorship, which, by the way, is that term is different or means somewhat different things depending on what state you're in. So in the state of California, we're talking about conservatorship. I found out in the state of Texas, where I am right now, we don't necessarily use that term. We use the term guardianship, which actually is a little bit easier to understand. And this is a definition that a lawyer just gave me earlier today. And it really hits home about how important conservatorship or guardianship really is. It's stripping someone of their rights without their consent. So you're stripping someone completely of almost all their rights without their consent. And what this lawyer told me is that it's potentially the most restrictive status you could have. In fact, people in prison might actually have more rights to their own decisions than someone under conservatorship, but it's for very specific individuals. Now, I haven't talked a lot about this story regarding Britney Spears because I like celebrity news, but I want to give you something smarter always, right? So if we get a headline like Kim Kardashian getting divorced, we may use that headline to talk about the state of marriage in America, right? If Justin Bieber's getting married, we're going to take a look at whether or not your age determines the success of your marriage. Turns out the sweet spot is between 25 and 35. So I like to give you something that's a little bit smarter. And we really haven't been able to do this. And we've struggled with this particular story. And it's because there's several really key pieces, key facts that are missing from this conversation. And I think it's important to know that. So Britney Spears is saying that this conservatorship crosses the line, that's taking away her rights and, quite frankly, putting her in a traumatized state. What's important to know about conservatorship is that it's really for people that are in a very specific category. So someone, for example, that has had a traumatic brain injury and is never going to be able to care for themselves. Someone that has a disability that is severely affecting their decision making for themselves. So we're talking about permanent states for an individual that's basically making them incapacitated to make some very basic decisions. What's interesting is that in the state of Texas, mental health is not one of the reasons that someone could ask for guardianship over you, for example. And so mental health is often discussed related to Britney Spears, although we have no facts to suggest any sort of mental health diagnosis. So there is a question within the legal community about what actually qualified her for conservatorship in California and why it's lasted so long. And I think it's important just to know that that's happening. One lawyer that I spoke to said that you have to think about conservatorship sort of like an invasive medical procedure. You're really happy it's available in the event of an emergency. It can save your life, but it's only used in very specific situations. And so again, why is it being used specifically for Britney Spears? Also, Britney Spears is making some really serious allegations saying that she has no control, for example, over her own health decisions, like whether or not she can get pregnant. But it's interesting, in the state of California, if you look further into conservatorship there, it says that under the law, someone that's under conservatorship has the right to marry, to vote, and make medical decisions unless a judge rules otherwise. And we don't know of any court ruling that would have taken those rights away for Britney Spears. So something's going on here that we can't quite figure out. The individual feels like the state is crossing the line, but the state has a conservatorship in place for a reason. And it is very difficult and a long process to get conservatorship over an individual. So those are a couple of things that I think do make us smarter on the topic, but bring up that question of, well, what's actually crossing the line? Who's crossing the line here? And what are the next steps? So as I mentioned, one of the kind of the fascinating things about conservatorship, I never really even thought could be the case, is that someone under this guardianship could have less rights than somebody that's actually behind bars. And we have a really big court case this week that has finally come to one chapter end of a conclusion. The officer convicted of killing George Floyd. He received his sentence today, and it's 22 and a half years in prison. And the reason why the judge, who's, by the way, the sole decider of the sentence, made this decision about this particular sentence, it could have been much fewer years. It could have been several more years, but he chose 22 and a half years. He said that the officer crossed the line. In there was cruelty involved in how he crossed the line in his interaction with George Floyd. And that's why the state, the judge, said this individual crossed the line, and that is why they're receiving this sentence. So an interesting, different question in the news about who crosses the line and then what are the consequences for that. Speaking of that, we're getting another really important court case that you should know about. I know there's been a lot of talk about voting laws in America, election laws, what's happening at a state level, federal level. Well, the federal government came out today and is suing the state of Georgia. Georgia passed some new voting laws. And what the federal government is saying is that these laws are essentially discriminatory, that Georgia is putting these laws in place in an effort to specifically target Black voters that are trying to exercise their right to vote and making it harder for them to vote. So this is what the Department of Justice is alleging about the state. Now, the state of Georgia is saying, hey, federal government, you're actually crossing the line. In fact, the governor issued a statement that said this lawsuit, I'm quoting the governor of Georgia, the lawsuit is born out of lies and misinformation the Biden administration has pushed against Georgia's Election Integrity Act from the start. So Georgia's coming back at the federal government and saying, no, that's not going to happen. So what's really important to note is that the U.S. Constitution actually requires that states determine how we are going to vote in federal elections. This is why it always looks a little different depending on what state you are in, what it looks like to vote, how early you can vote, whether or not you need to bring an ID or you can do mail-in voting, and how that's all determined on a state level. That said, states just can't make any laws that they want, and they're subject to federal laws as well. And this is why we're seeing this clash where both sides are saying to the other side, hey, you're crossing the line, and ultimately this will be decided in courts. So this is going to be important to watch because we're seeing states make changes at a local level about how we're voting in elections. And we're really getting a lot of attention focused on Republican states, which Georgia is. The state legislature is Republican. And we're seeing that the Biden administration is willing to take a Republican state to court over this particular issue. And so if it happens with the state of Georgia, will it happen elsewhere? And how does it set a precedent for future administrations as well? So any of these stories really can spark a heated debate. But if we frame the question of who's crossing the line, we can actually have kind of a fruitful conversation. Who's crossing the line when it comes to Britney Spears? Is the state crossing the line, or is somebody else? Or do we really not have an accurate picture to ask that question? Who's crossing the line when it comes to law enforcement and the citizen, or vice versa? And who's crossing the line when it comes to setting up really good voting laws in America? Is the federal government overstepping, or is the state overstepping? Ultimately, we'll see what happens in courts. So that gives us a framework for a couple of the big stories this week, although apparently it may not even matter. Because late today, late on Friday, just breaking, the Pentagon releases a much-awaited report on UFOs. And by the way, you always release a report on a Friday afternoon when you don't want anyone to pay attention. Oldest trick in the book. But guess what? This is actually about aliens, so it's going to get a lot of attention. And don't worry, I'm going to look into it for you. But apparently, the big headline is there's a lot of things flying around, and we have no idea what they are. So we've covered a lot of really big stories over the last year on Smarter News. Aliens is not what I've expected, but we're going to be here for it. We're going to be here for it. I imagined quick, concise, nonpartisan news here on Earth, but we may be delivering to the entire universe. I'm going to need the weekend to rest and get up my endurance on this. But I promise you more on aliens next week on smarternews.com and the rest of these stories. all on smartnews.com. Have a great weekend.